start decks for Overdress were released back in May of 2021 and were followed by set 1 merely a week later. Since then, we have received quite a few more sets, and with the Overdress anime having aired its final episode and the DivineZ era looming over the horizon, we thought it would be appropriate to look back at all the units we have received. Welcome to the final installment of this series, until we move on from DivineZ, which I hope is very far in the future. I want to thank all of you for watching and subscribing, even though it's just a number. The fact that even one of you watch me ramble about cards, it makes doing this all worth it. I will be taking a break from the informative content for about 2 weeks while I come up with new ideas, so for now look forward to maybe some deck profiles and some gameplay. We have Prison, Gravidia, or Gravidia Mask, we have Magnolia Mask, we have Favernil. We have quite a few decks, and then we are prepping to maybe do some of the Lyrical Monasterio decks, but with the set just having released and no real product down here in our area, it'll be a while until we can get one of those decks fully built. But with that out of the way, let's just move on to the final units in this series, Touken Ranbu. This call-up has actually happened before in the G era, if I remember correctly, and unlike that time, the Overdress versions were a bit lackluster. But that really only applies to the first wave of Touken Ranbu units. There is one set that we have yet to receive, and although I'm not sure how good the units in the set will be in today's meta, the units are quite strong. One more disclaimer before we start this recap is that since the set has no English scans yet, I won't be talking about any other units besides the boss units, which, to be fair, none of them mention any specific units besides themselves, so the decks are honestly incredibly generic. And from a quick glance at the rearguard units in the first set, most are generic with no restrictions on things like names or anything like that. So it's pretty much build whatever way you want for any of these decks. But with that disclaimer out of the way, let's move into the list with the first Sword Boy, Hachisuka Kotetsu Kiwame. In his first form, he would provide your front row rearguards with a plus 5k power boost, and your back row rearguards with the boost ability if you had a total of 5 rearguards. Not great, but let's just look at his new form. His new form adds Sento to the end of his name, which is similar to the 4 other units we'll see after him. This new form has 3 abilities. The first states that he is regarded as his original form while on Vanguard or Rearguard Circle, which means you can Persona Ride by using either form. Next up is his second ability, which for a Counterblast lets you choose 3 rearguards and they get boost and plus 5k, a much better version of his old effect by not requiring you have 5 rearguards. If that was all, then I'd say he'd be pretty boring, but we have one more effect. His final effect allows you to put a card with the same name as him from hand or rearguard into soul to choose a rearguard and stand it. If you happen to have 2 or more grade 3 or greater cards with Hachisuka Kotetsu in soul, you can restand 2 rearguards instead. So 5 attacks for 1 card from hand or 1 rearguard. You can also counterblast 1 to pay for this effect if you persona that turn, so you don't have to waste any cards from hand or rearguard, which is actually pretty cool. A significant upgrade from his first form, and this trend will continue for pretty much every unit in this list that got a second form. Let's move on to the next Sword Boy, Kasen Kanesada Kiwame, who in this first form had 2 effects. The first allowed you to Soul Blast 1 and rest any number of your rearguards to give him plus 5k for each unit rested. His second effect stated that if his power was 30k or greater, your opponent would have to use at least 2 cards to guard his attack. Again, this effect isn't great, but we have to look at his Sento form. In this form, he has 3 effects. This first is similar to Hachisuka, allows him to be considered the same name as his original form while on Vanguard or Rearguard. Then the second effect was when he attacked, you could put a card with the same name as him from hand or Rearguard to soul, and he would gain plus 10k in a drive. This cost could be paid with a CB if you Persona Road, which is pretty good. But let's look at the last skill. During the battle he attacked, if your soul has 2 or more grade 3 or greater cards with Kasen Kanesada, he would require your opponent call 3 or more cards to Guardian Circle. So a effect similar to Flagberg with that 3 card guard restriction. I will say I think Kasen is the weakest of the new forms, but without being able to see the whole set, it is hard to judge him accurately. Let's move on to the third Sword Boy, Kashu Kiyumitsu Kiwame, who was actually the trial deck unit for this collab. So let's look at the trial deck form. It would gain plus 10k if you had no face-up cards in your damage zone during your turn. He could also Counterblast and Soul Blast 1 to look at the top card of your deck and put it on the top or bottom, and then you draw a card. So you couldn't really stack, which was a little bit unfortunate. Again, these first forms are pretty boring effects, nothing too crazy. But his Sento form is the real boss, so let's look at him. Same effect as the previous 2. counts himself as the original on Vanguard or Rearguard. His second effect would require you discard a card and then put a Rearguard or a card with the same name as him from hand into soul. This would allow him to restand, but you have to decrease or increase his drive and crit to 1. So you don't get to keep Twin Drive. If you were to have 2 or more grade 3 or greater cards with his name in soul, he would gain another ability, which stated at the end of the battle he attacked, you could counterblast 1 and restand him. He would lose a drive, but this meant you could get a total of 3 Vanguard swings in just 1 turn. Similar to the other 2, if you Persona wrote this turn, you could pay his first effect with the CB instead, so you wouldn't have to discard a card or put a card from hand to soul, which meant that technically you would get more cards as you went along, right? You didn't have to discard cards from hand. The loss of drive is a little bit annoying. I mean, I wish maybe he just got to keep the 1, but if he gets big enough, your opponent has to just keep wasting cards, and there might be a card in the set to help him. Fortunately, the second set is pretty much all in Japanese, and it would take way too long for me to get all the cards read. But next up we have, oh god bless, why are these names so hard? Alright, I can do this. We have Mutsu no Kami Yoshiyuki Kiwame, whose first form would gain plus 2k if your opponent had no back row rear guards. His second effect would allow you to counterblast 1 when he attacked to return an opponent's back row rear guard, and then he gained plus 5k for each open back row rear guard your opponent had. I think this is probably one of the worst ones as well, with the max you can get being 17k for both of his effects proccing at full power. It makes him like a 30k, which is not a crazy number for a Vanguard nowadays, but again, just like the others, he's got a Cento form. Same effect as the previous units, same name on Van and Rearguard Circle. His second effect allowed you to counterblast 1 and retire an opponent's rearguard. Then he'd gain plus 5k for each open back row your opponent had, so similar to his original effect, but at least the retire wasn't locked to a back row rearguard this time. Then his final effect would trigger when he attacked and required you to put a card with the same name from hand or rearguard into soul to then look at top 7, and you'd call a card to Rearguard Circle. If you were to have 2 or more grade 3 or greater cards with Mutsu no Kami Yoshiyuki in soul, you could call 2 instead of 1. Just like all the others, if you Persona Road, you could activate this effect for a CB instead, which is, again, makes them pretty good. Next up, we have Yamanbagiri Kunihiro Kiwame, who I think was probably one of the best original forms from the first set, as he could gain a crit if you Persona Road, and he would also let you counterblast 1 when he attacked to call a card from hand to an open rearguard circle. You could also pay this cost by just soul blasting a copy of himself instead. At least he had a 4th attack. I'm not sure if the original ones did as well, but let's look at his Cento form, as that's where the real interesting effects are. Same first effect, same name as the original while on Van or Rear. His second effect would grant him a crit and gave your front row plus 5k if you had 2 or more grade 3 or greater cards with Yamanbagiri Kunihiro in soul. Then his final effect said that at the end of his attack, you could put a card with the same name as him from hand or rearguard into soul to then draw a card and call a card from hand. The unit called would gain plus 10k in a crit. So only 4 attacks, but with 2 of them having criticals, the pressure from this deck is crazy. Oh, and just like the others, you can counterblast 1 instead of the normal cost if you Persona Road. But lastly, we have one more unit who wasn't introduced in the first set and is being debuted in the second Touken Ranbu set. And that is Mikasuki Munichika Kiwame. He has 3 abilities, so quite a bit of text, but the first ability would give him plus 5k and a crit if you have 3 or more standing rear guards. This is only during your turn, but hey, extra damage is always nice. That's when you want the crits, during your turn. His second effect will let you Soul Blast 2 and look at the top 2 to call up to 1 to rearguard and put the rest on top or bottom in any order. So you could either get a unit or stack some triggers, which is always nice when you can stack. So it's already a great start for this guy, but we have one more effect that said when he attacked a grade 3 or greater unit, you could discard 2 cards from hand to restand 3 front row rear guards. So he's got 5 attacks going second, which is pretty good, and even going first, he still has that crit and power, requiring less cards to get stuff done, where the other 5 require you play the originals in most cases to have the cards to put into soul. This guy's just got the 5 attacks set up. The second wave of the Touken Ranbu set I think is pretty insane, with all of them pretty much having multi-attack or some insane power. I don't know how good they will be in the meta once they release, as we are moving into DivineZ era, and we've got those new faded cards, whatever they're called. So it's kind of hard to gauge where they're going to be, as we don't know all the effects of the DivineZ units. But they could come in and just do some real damage, but we have to wait and see. I again thank you all for watching and for subscribing. This has been Leo. I'll see you on Cray.